Hello, I'm Mike Wheeler, and today we're going to talk about keeping your work environment safe. This is going to be week 12 of our safety and leadership course. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain how keeping your workplace clean and organized can reduce the risk of accidents or injuries. Explain why setting paths for foot traffic in a workplace can reduce the risk of accidents and injuries. You're going to define what is classified as a confined space and explain what the hazards associated with them. Explain the general safety rules when working with ladders, and then explain the general safety rules regarding fall protection. So, clean and organized work areas. Keeping your work areas and access routes clean and clear of obstructions is key to workplace safety. Dirty and cluttered work areas often invite accidents and injuries. They're also less productive and less enjoyable to work in. Bring out only the tools you need for a specific job and then put them away when you're done with them. It's really tempting to just, and I'm guilty of myself, I just keep bringing tools out, and pretty soon, like I'm laying down in a giant pile of tools. That's not ideal for anybody. So bring out what you need, put it away when you're done, start the next job. Keep cords and hoses flat to the ground as possible and as out of the way as possible. If you got a hose or a cord that's going to be there for a long time, you can tape it down to the floor just so it's less of a trip hazard. Periodically sweep out your work area to reduce slip hazards of grit, shavings, and debris. It also, if you're running air tools, it'll also keep you from blowing those grit and shavings into the air so you're not inhaling them or getting in your eyes. Clean your tools when you're done with them and inspect them for damage or wear. Every time you put tools away, you should be checking them for damage. Every time you pick them up to use them, you should be checking them for damage. And the same thing goes with cords and cables. As you roll up your cords, cables, and hoses, use this opportunity to inspect them as well, and do this every day. That's when I found most of the damage to my cables and cords when I'm rolling them up for the end of the day, and I'm like, oh man, forklift got this one or whatever. But use cleanup as an inspection time. Another thing for an organized work area is never block access to first aid or safety equipment or egress points. It's very easy for routes to the exits, fire extinguishers, eye wash stations, power disconnects to become blocked by stored material or even trash cans. Always make sure there's clear access to these items. Now, a lot of these things like fire extinguishers and electrical boxes, in a lot of workplaces they'll have either squares around them painted off on the floor or taped off on the floor because there's minimum distances you have to have open to those. And that's great. The problem is it does no good to have those distances marked off if the entire route to the fire extinguisher is blocked off by trash cans or pallets of parts. You have to be able to have access to those things. And ideally in a workplace, you'll have designated walkways for foot traffic or parts delivery. This is one of those things that big places end up going to because it is much safer. But the reason why designated walkways are so good is that it cuts down the amount of stuff that you really have to worry about cleaning up. Like, you need to keep the walkway clear. The rest of the stuff is not as important. And the cool thing about that is if there is a fire alarm or you have to evacuate in a hurry, people aren't, hurtling over pallets of parts. They get to the walkway and they walk out. And it also lets you control people coming into the shop. If you're in a shop that's got a bunch of man doors all over it, if you designate a couple of those as entry points for office staff and stuff like that, the odds of them walking through a door unexpectedly and getting a face full of grinder shavings goes down dramatically. And if you've got walkways, you have to stretch cords or cables across them. They make walkover plates to contain them. They're usually made out of plastic. And don't store parts and materials in the walkway. So confined spaces. In the construction industry, confined spaces, and there are two types, kill many each year. We need to understand what they are and what makes them dangerous. So per OSHA, a confined space means that it's large enough and so configured that an employee can enter and perform assigned work and has limited or restricted means for entry or exit. And they've got a bunch of examples: tanks, silos, storage bins, hoppers. And it's not designed for continued employee occupancy. So notice the "and" at the end of these items. All of these need to be present to make something a confined space. So to me, what we need to think about is that confined spaces, we often think of like small claustrophobic areas. And the reality is that's not necessarily the case. A big room could be a confined space if the ability to get in and out of that room is difficult. Like you got to go through a small hole. And it's not, to be that, it would not be designed for you know, sustained occupancy and all these other things. But just as a reminder, confined spaces don't have to be small. They can be big. But if they've got limited entrance and exit points, they can be dangerous as well. And there's also a PRCS classification, which is a permit required confined space. And these are more the ones we think about as being really dangerous. And these are confined space that contains or has the potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere, or contains a material that has the potential for engulfing an entrant, or has an internal configuration such as an entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls, or a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a small cross-section, or contains any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. Now notice there's no ands on this list, they're ors. If any one of these things is present, it's defined as a permit required confined space. So PRCS, an entry permit for a PRCS is defined by OSHA as a written or printed document that's provided by the employer to allow and control entry into a permit space, and that contains the necessary information as required below. And here are all the talking points. Your permit, it'll have a list of the confined spaces that you're going to enter. It'll have the purpose, the date, and the authorized duration, so how long it's good for. Usually it's a day. It'll have the authorized entrance within that permit space, either by name or number or something, so we know who it is. Then their names, their supervisors' names, hazards, measures used to isolate permit space and control, to eliminate or control other occupational hazards, acceptable entry conditions. That'll be, you know, air sampling meets this requirement or whatever. The results of any initial or periodic test performed, including the initials of who did the tests. Rescue and emergency service will be called on and how they're going to do that work. Communication process to authorize entry. Equipment that you need, including rescue equipment, and any other information that's inclusion is necessary. And what this basically does is it makes people assess risk and then plan for failure. Nobody thinks they're going to need rescue equipment in a confined space. And then when something bad happens, they've got to go get the stuff and bring it to the job site and then get the person out. By that time, usually it's too late. So, like, everything's got to be available. And this is what this checklist does, is make sure that you've thought about the risks, thought about how you're going to get in, how you're going to get out, what's going to happen in case of emergency, and have all that stuff accessible to you. Ladder safety. So ladder accidents are very common, both on and off the job. Many of you probably know somebody that's fallen off a ladder or fallen off one yourself. I never have, but I've come incredibly close a couple times. So ladders are everywhere in construction because they're so useful and they make accessing out of reach areas so easy. About 500,000 people are treated for injuries and 300 die from ladder-related injuries each year. And ladder accidents are almost always the operator's fault. They use the ladder improperly, so it moves while in use, or they don't follow usage direction. So if you look at this pie chart down here, overwhelmingly, it's either the ladder moved, they missed a step, or they slipped, or they lost their balance on the ladder. And out of these where the ladder moved, most of it is the bottom of the ladder slid out, and that's what caused the accident. Some simple safety rules can reduce the likelihood of falling. Use the correct ladder to make sure it's rated for the weight and the conditions required. You know, if your ladder is rated for 250 pounds and you weigh 250 pounds on the scale, that's not enough because you're going to be carrying tools with you in all likelihood. So you need a ladder rated for the weight, the actual weight of what you're doing. You need to inspect the ladder before you use for damage or wear, and do that every time. Make sure the surface of the ladder is on, will support its use without movement or slipping. So, you know, a slick surface that'll let the bottom of the ladder slide out, or a soft and even surface that'll let the ladder slip sideways. We don't want that. If you're using a ladder to access a roof or other higher up surface that you're going to step off onto, the ladder must extend a minimum of 3 feet above the surface you're accessing, and that gives you, you know, good handles to step off the ladder and onto this new surface. And then, you know, conversely, getting down off that surface, you've got, you know, you're not all scrunched up trying to crawl on your knees and basically trying to fall off the roof getting on the ladder. If you're taking tools up, you need to carry those tools in a tool belt or use a hand line to raise them after you're at working height. Because we want 3 points of contact at all times when we're on a ladder. I missed that. I actually missed that bullet point. Use 3 points of contact when climbing or descending a ladder, and always face the ladder when you're doing it. If you've got an armful of tools, you're not going to have 3 points of contact. And it's not, a hand, a foot, and an elbow. It's hands or feet. And as welders, we should always only use fiberglass or wood ladders because they're not electrically conductive. But anytime you're working around electricity, the same is true. Aluminum ladders, they're cheap and they're light. They're electrically conductive. We don't want to use those as welders. Basic fall protection. So we'll just cover real basics. It's a big subject, but fall protection doesn't always refer to wearing a harness and working at elevation. The most common injuries happen at ground level or just below it, as a matter of fact. So when we think of fall protection, most of the time we're thinking about people working high above the ground wearing a harness, tied off to a fall arrest point, red iron construction, stuff like that. But the majority of workplace injuries and falls takes place on ladders, near holes or pits at ground level, or stepping off a higher surface onto a lower one. So make sure holes on a work site are covered or blocked off. If you've got an edge you could fall from, guardrails are a much better solution than fall protection. Because even, a 2-foot fall can be life-changing if you come off it wrong. Fall protection is required anytime you're 4 feet above the lower surface. And if you're using a harness, you must be trained in its use, and you must inspect it and all other fall protection equipment, your lanyard, your fall arrest system, all that kind of stuff before use. And all this stuff needs to be formally inspected and signed off monthly. So it's not just, I've got my harness, it's behind the seat of my truck, had the same one for 8 years. We need to be a lot more formal about it than that. Wrap up. So key ideas: clean and organized work areas are not only safer but more efficient and enjoyable to work in. There are 2 classifications of confined spaces. You need to be able to determine which one applies to your situation and what is required to perform work in them. We need to take confined spaces very seriously. They kill a lot of people every year. Ladder safety is critical because most of us will use them often in the trade, use the correct ladder for the job, and use it safely. Fall protection is a factor not just when working at elevation, but anywhere you can fall from one surface to another. And fall protection is a big topic, and you will need training for much of it in the workplace. References? That's it, and I will see you in class.